Welcome, world history students. This unit, we are going to explore Greece and Persia. Greece and Persia. Greece has a really heavy influence on Western civilization. And so a lot of the things we talk about, you will view as familiar. You're also pretty familiar with some of the mythical beginnings of ancient Greece. Persia is probably a little less familiar to you, and that is why we're going to place additional emphasis on Persia in this unit. So the history and culture of classical Greece has had a significant impact on the modern world, and in particular, your world. Away we go. So just as this kind of common theme to remind us where we started and how this is all connected to the other things that we've been talking about, the ancient Greeks are also part of that Indo-European population that migrated out of the Caucasus mountain area, out of the steppes a long, long time ago. And we have followed groups of Indo-Europeans down here to Asia Minor and studied the Hittites. We have followed them into India and looked at the Aryans in a lot of detail. And in this unit, we're going to follow this group that came down here and became the Medes and the Persians, and then also the Greeks right in here. Okay. So all ties back to early common beginnings. You can see that this unit is divided into a number of sections. Some of them we'll cover and some of them we will not. We'll definitely be covering the Persian Wars, ancient Greece's beginnings, and then the Peloponnesian Wars when Sparta and Athens are fighting with one another, and the Persian Wars. And then finally we'll hit democracy's kind of golden age in Greece and talk about Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and people like that. And then finally end with Alexander the Great and how he brings the Greeks and the Persians together once again. Okay, today we're going to look at how geography plays a role in the way that a people develop. So this Roman numeral 1 in your brand new unit on Greece and Persia. So this is Roman numeral 1, culture of the mountain and the seas. Okay, so Roman numeral 1, cultures of the mountain and the sea. And your big A would be geography shapes Greek life. So one of the things that people perhaps don't know when we look at the Greek peninsula, it looks like a Greek peninsula, and you guys already know quite a bit about the ancient Greeks. You probably know about Zeus and Hera and Athena and people like that. But what you might not know is that Greece is actually made up of more than 2,000 separate islands that are all part of the Greek Empire. So it's a lot more varied than people think. The lay of the land also, because it's separated into so many different islands, it's a lot of distinct kind of personalities. So in ancient Greece, the people there didn't refer to themselves as Greeks and didn't think of themselves as a unit. They weren't unified in ancient Greece. Instead, from one island to the next, they would have identified much more locally with their language and their community. So it's a collection of a lot of separate lands where Greek-speaking people lived, but they weren't very unified, and more than 2,000 islands were dotted throughout this part of the Mediterranean that were making up the Greeks. The sea, as you can imagine, when we're talking about a peninsula like this and so many different islands, 2,000 different islands, the sea played an extremely important role in life. The sea shaped Greek civilization just like rivers shaped the ancient civilizations of Egypt, the Fertile Crescent, in India, and in China. In one sense, the Greeks did not live on land, but around the sea. Greeks rarely had to travel more than 85 miles to reach the coastline. The Aegean Sea, the Ionian Sea, and the neighboring Black Sea were really important transportation routes for the Greek people. And these seaways linked most parts of Greece. As the Greeks became skilled sailors, sea travel connected Greece with other societies. Sea travel and trade were also important because Greece lacked natural resources like timber, metals, and largely usable farmland. So, just like the Phoenicians before them, just like the Minoans before that, this Mediterranean region was really heavily influenced by trade and communication with other civilizations along the coastline of the Mediterranean. Okay, if you look at this map down here in the bottom left, not only did islands help kind of dictate the way that isolated communities grew up from one another, and it lacked unity. People didn't refer to themselves as Greeks, but it, on top of being isolated as far as the water was concerned, they were also isolated because of the mountainous terrain. So the Greek peninsula is made up of a lot of like mountainous ranges that limit travel over land. In the last slide, we talked about the city-states that were made up of ancient Greece. Largely, they were located near the coastline, and in part that was because the mountains made it difficult to do very effective overland travel. You'll note that very few city-states are actually inland. Sparta is a good example of an inland city-state, but almost all the others are out there on the edges near the coastline. This mountainous region also created not a lot of large-scale, flat, fertile agricultural opportunities. So there wasn't a lot of land to be growing food, and as a result, their populations are going to stay relatively small. In fact, most city-states aren't going to get above about 10,000. And the city-state is defined as not just the city, so not just the city itself, but the surrounding areas. So usually a city-state like Sparta, like Athens, for example, like Olympia, for example, it would be the city itself and then either the expanding like 50 miles out. Sometimes if a city-state wasn't located near another city-state like Sparta, it might control as much as 500 miles like radius around it. But generally speaking, it led to a small population and the need for colonies. So they needed to set up colonies around the Mediterranean in order to get the things that they needed to survive. The climate of ancient Greece is interesting because it's pretty temperate, meaning that it stays fairly mild. Climate was the third important environmental influence on the Greek civilization. Greece had a varied climate with temperatures averaging between 48 degrees Fahrenheit in the winter and about 80 degrees in the summer. In ancient times, these moderate temperatures supported a really rigorous outdoor life for many Greek citizens. Men spent most of their time or much of their leisure time at outdoor public events. They met often to discuss public issues, exchange news, and take part in a really active civic life, and it all tended to take place outside. Last piece for today. So earlier, we talked about a large wave of Indo-Europeans that migrated from the Eurasian steppes to Europe, India, and Southwest Asia. And some of the people who settled on the Greek mainland around 2000 BCE were later known as the Mycenaeans. The name came from their leading city, Mycenae, which you can see here in this map right here. Mycenae was located in the southern Greece on a steep rocky ridge, and it was surrounded by a protective wall more than 20 feet thick. It was a heavily fortified city, and it could withstand almost any attack. From Mycenae, a warrior king ruled the surrounding villages and farms. Strong rulers controlled the area around the Mycenaean cities, such as Tyrenes and Athens. These kings dominated Greece from about 1600 to 1100 BCE. The Mycenaeans had a lot of influence over early Greece. And in fact, you'll notice by the city-state of Athens already being created that these are early Greeks. So the Mycenaeans are going to have a lot of influence. The Mycenaean people were in contact with the Minoan people. And so you already know quite a bit about the Minoan people, that there was a king and that bulls were extremely important, that the sea life was extremely important, that they were relatively peaceful for at least part of their civilization's reign over the Mediterranean, and that they were extremely dependent upon trade. And in fact, that their power came from dominating that trade. So the power shift that occurred that led from the Minoan civilization kind of falling, it started to migrate up to the Greek mainland. And initially it was the Mycenaean people that are growing in strength. And this whole peninsula, that whole peninsula will become the Greek civilization as time goes on. Sometime after 1500 BCE, sometime after that, through either trade or war, the Mycenaeans came into contact with the Minoan civilization. And from their contact with the Minoans, the Mycenaeans saw the value in seaborne trade. Mycenaean traders soon sailed throughout the eastern Mediterranean, making stops at the Aegean Islands, coastal towns in Anatolia, which is Asia Minor, and ports in Syria, Egypt, Italy, and Crete. And you remember we left Syria not too long ago when we were talking about Judaism and the Phoenician Empire. The Minoans also influenced the Mycenaeans in other ways. The Mycenaeans adapted the Minoan writing system and adapted the Minoan writing system to the Greek language. They decorated vases with Minoan designs. So a lot of that early Minoan artwork that we looked at, you're going to see that replicated by the Mycenaeans. The Minoans influenced culture of Mycenae. It formed the core of Greek religious practice. It influenced their art, their politics, and their literature. Indeed, Western civilization has its roots in these two really early Mediterranean civilizations. So you'll see Troy up here as a city-state on the edge of Asia Minor. And that's where we're going to end our day with a quick story. Sometime during 1200 BCE, sometime during that century, it seems that the Mycenaeans fought a 10-year war against the city-state of Troy, an independent trading city located in Anatolia/Asia Minor. According to legend, a Greek army besieged and destroyed Troy because a Trojan prince had kidnapped a beautiful wife of a Greek king named Helen. For many years, historians thought that the legendary stories told of the Trojan War were totally fictional. However, just like when they backtracked and looked at these legends around the Minotaur, they found excavations conducted in northwestern Turkey during the 1870s by a Greek archaeologist named Heinrich Schliemann suggested that the stories of the Trojan War might have been based on real cities, based on real people and real events. That does not mean, I just want to caution you, when I say that we look at legends to find like historical truths, I'm not suggesting there really was a Minotaur. I'm not suggesting that there really was all the things that are going to be part of this Trojan War legend. However, that there was historical truth working throughout. So there were threads of truth in the legend. Further archaeological studies conducted in the 20th century support Schliemann's findings. Although the exact nature of the Trojan War remains unclear, there was an attack on Troy that was almost certainly came at the hands of the Mycenaeans. So we're going to end the day with a story. I'm going to tell a modified version of the story. Okay, so at this point you would need to be logged into Socrative. There are 10 questions that'll be waiting there for you. And as I tell you the story, you should answer the questions. Okay? So quick break. Okay, stories and history, ancient Greece. So according to legend, at one point in history, outside the city of Troy, there was a giant, strange creature that was standing at the gate. The people of Troy didn't know what to do with it. They examined it, looked at it carefully, and thought that it looked like an enormous wooden horse. They didn't know what this meant, so they pulled it inside of the city gates and then went about celebrating because they had just won a magnificent victory over a group of people that had come and attacked them. So the Trojans were now celebrating. They believed that perhaps this was a gift left behind as kind of a token of, okay, you beat us and let's be at peace. So they drag this gift inside of the walls of the city and then they begin their celebration. Now we have to go backward in time a little bit because we have to figure out like how in the world did we end up with a horse standing at the gate of the city of Troy. So we're going to go back in time. There was in ancient Mycenae a king who had a beautiful wife named Helen. Here we go. We need to go back further in time to an ancient legend about Greek gods and goddesses and fighting that was taking place. So a long, long time ago, there was a party supposedly, and we're talking ancient Greek legend now, ancient Greek god party. And all of the gods, almost all of the gods, were invited to the party, except for one, the goddess of discord. The goddess of discord realized that she was not invited to the party and decided that she was kind of angry about this. So she decided that she was going to create some trouble. She decided that she was going to send a golden apple down to the party and say that this is to the fairest of them all. So all of the goddesses, the Greek goddesses that were at the party, assumed that the golden apple must be for them. So the goddesses are arguing over who should be the receiver of the golden apple. And some of the key figures that were arguing were Athena, goddess of wisdom, Hera, goddess of beauty, and Aphrodite, the goddess of love. So they all viewed themselves as very, very beautiful and thought for sure that this was going to be awarded to them. However, when they started to argue, Zeus, king of the gods, king of the Greek gods, realized that a girl fight is not a situation he wants to be in. So he decides that he doesn't want to decide. He's just going to be passive aggressive and peace out. And so Zeus didn't want to decide. And he decided that he was going to have someone else do the deciding. So he picked a supposedly handsome boy named Paris on Earth and left it to him to try to choose. So Zeus decides he's not getting in the middle of this kind of cat fight, and he bestows the power to choose upon a young man named Paris. So supposedly, according to the story, each of the goddesses try to woo Paris by promising him something really powerful. So Athena promises him all the wisdom in the world. And Hera promises him power. And Aphrodite promises him the love of the most beautiful woman in the world. And then she goes on to suggest the woman on earth that looks most like herself as someone who would fall in love with him. And so Paris chooses unwisely, according to most. He doesn't choose to be wise and he doesn't choose to be powerful. He chose to be loved by the most beautiful woman. So the person on earth that Aphrodite says so he chooses Aphrodite, and Aphrodite says, I suggest the woman that looks most like me on earth. And so Paris turns to his desires to a beautiful woman named Helen. Now, if you remember at the beginning of the story, Helen is the queen. She's the wife of a very powerful king. But Paris wants Helen anyway, because Aphrodite has kind of cast this kind of spell over him, as Greek gods and goddesses often do, manipulate people's feelings. So Paris goes off and falls in love with Helen, and Helen falls in love with him. And Helen really can't understand why this is happening. She's pretty happy with the king, but she has just this overwhelming desire to be with Paris, who isn't all that physically impressive, to be quite honest. But she can't help herself because, of course, the gods and goddesses are working behind the scene to make this happen. So she takes off on the king. Helen takes off on the king, and she heads back with Paris to Troy. Now, when the king finds out about this, he brings together a massive military, a massive army, powerful warriors from throughout his kingdom to go and take the queen back. He gathers the best. Agamemnon, Odysseus, Achilles are all going to play a role in this story. They're all going to go and fight eventually. And they sail off to Troy. And they arrive and they know that Paris and Helen are inside the walls of Troy, and they decide that they're just going to bash down the doors and get her back. And also destroy Troy in the process because, of course, Troy is responsible, right? Paris is a prince in this kingdom. He has a father who is king, and his father, is really pretty disappointed in Paris for bringing home a woman that's going to start a war. Okay, so there is one of the soldiers that we talked about before named Achilles. He was kind of hesitant to fight. He didn't feel like, fighting a war over this situation was necessary at first. And he decides he's going to hold back. And it's important that Achilles is holding back, because Achilles is one of those people that are just natural leaders, extremely powerful, and the other soldiers will follow Achilles. So they're kind of fighting half-heartedly for Agamemnon and Odysseus, but Achilles, he really wields power. So Achilles is kind of holding back and he's not really fighting. But then his best friend dresses up in his armor and goes off and fights. And in the process of that happening, his best friend, whose name is Patroclus, is killed. And Achilles gets really angry, even though Patroclus being dressed in his own armor made it seem as if Achilles was in the fight. Achilles is still mad at the person who killed Patroclus, and it enrages him. And he decides that he is going to come and fight the battle as well. So Achilles now enters into the battle to fight against Troy as well. Here's Achilles. You guys have probably watched Troy before. It tells of this story. Here's Achilles deciding that he is going to go and fight. Paris is here, and this is his older brother Hector, who's in line for the throne. And Achilles and Hector are going to do battle, in part because Paris was fearful. He was running away. And so he and Hector do battle, and Hector is killed. Achilles takes his body, which is a horrible offense in Greek tradition, and instead of allowing it to be buried, he pulls it around on the back of a chariot throughout the city and then leaves it out in the open for dogs to eat. So when this is all over, there's like siege laid to this. A funeral pyre is the way the Greeks usually bury their dead. So at this point, the Greeks all retreat from Troy. They decide there's a 10-year siege that goes on, and they decide that they're going to kind of fool the Trojans. And so they leave this giant horse behind, loaded with soldiers inside, and they pull all their troops back. And so the Trojans, when they get up and realize that the forces are all gone, they believe that they have been victorious. They finally have like held out long enough, and that they are successful. So they pull the giant horse inside. There was a woman, a like soothsayer, that was telling them at the time, this is a trick, this is a trick. But because she was kind of on the outskirts of society, nobody listened to her. And her name was Cassandra. She could supposedly see the fates of the future, but they didn't listen to her. So the Trojan horse, as you guys are probably familiar with, was filled with soldiers. And as soon as the Trojans started to celebrate, drank into the night and fell asleep, then the soldiers slowly crawled out of the horse and took the city from the inside, and thus led to the very fall of the Trojan city. It was devastated. The women and children were all taken off as slaves. However, Helen was spared the fate of many who were carried off as slaves and sold. There's a famous story of Achilles, who, according to tradition, his mother, he was half god, half human, and that his mother had taken him by the heel and dipped him into gold, or dipped him into something that was supposed to protect him for all of his life, and make him kind of impenetrable by weapons. But where she held him when she dipped him was by the ankle. And so supposedly Achilles gets hit in the ankle, right at the spot, the only spot that he was vulnerable. And so Achilles' heel is named after Achilles' heel, and this whole idea that his mother had tried to protect him and he was only vulnerable in that very spot. So Achilles is taken down. The Trojan city is burned, and all of the women and children are sold into slavery, minus Helen. Okay, that should be enough to have answered the questions, and that is the legend. Okay, thank you very much. I will see you next time.